All right, let's talk about something we've all heard of, the sexual double standard. You know, the whole stud versus slut thing. It really feels kind of old-fashioned, doesn't it? Like something from our parents' generation that we're supposed to be past. But are we? Are we really past it?
So just to make sure we're on the same page, let's get a clear definition. The source for this explainer, a really fascinating study, defines the sexual double standard, they call it SDS, as when the exact same sexual behavior gets judged differently based purely on who's doing it, a man or a woman. Yeah, the stud versus slut dynamic, pretty much in a nutshell.
And, that leads to the big question, right? In a world that's pushing so hard for equality, do people actually still think this way, or is it just a ghost from a less enlightened time?
Well, what does the research actually tell us? Turns out it is not that simple, not at all. Most of us, if you ask us, will say, of course, I believe in equality. But our real deep down attitudes, they can be a lot more complicated. It seems the bias didn't just disappear, it might have just gotten better at hiding. So, to get past what we say and find out what we truly believe, some researchers in Spain went out and surveyed over 1,200 adults. And they had a really clever way of getting at the truth, a new way of asking the question.
And this is where they came up with a brilliant twist. They figured that to really understand this, you can't just look at one side of the coin. Nope. You have to introduce a whole new idea into the mix.
See, for years, research pretty much only focused on what the study calls sexual freedom. You can think of this as, valuing someone for being open and active and expressive with their sexuality. It's the stud part of the classic idea. This slide makes it super clear. On one side, you've got sexual freedom, which we just talked about. But on the other side, the researchers added this concept of sexual shyness. And this is about valuing stuff like decorum, chastity, restraint. By looking at both of these things, they could paint a much more detailed picture of what's going on in our heads. So here's the million-dollar question. Does adding this whole new dimension, this idea of shyness, totally change what we see? Does it uncover biases that the old way of measuring just couldn't catch? Yeah, spoiler alert, it absolutely does.
So what did they actually find? Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Because the results, they are probably not what you're expecting.
Okay, so first up, sexual freedom. Looking at the chart, you see men rate sexual freedom highly for other men. No big surprise there. But here's the kicker. Women do too. They also rate men's sexual freedom more positively. And then you look at that third bar, how both groups rate sexual freedom for women, and boom, it's way lower. To put it in social psychology terms, men showed in-group favoritism. They rooted for their own team. But women showed out-group favoritism. They actually favored the other group, men. I mean, wow, that's a pretty wild result. It suggests this whole standard is maybe way more ingrained than we even realize. Okay, but now watch what happens when we flip it over to sexual shyness. The whole thing reverses. Now, men rate shyness more positively for women than they do for other men. And, just as interesting, women rate shyness more positively for men than for themselves. It seems like both groups prefer shyness in the other gender.
So just to be clear on this, because it's a huge point, the context changes everything. When we're talking about freedom, women seem to favor men. But the second the conversation shifts to shyness, it flips, and it looks like both genders value things like decorum more in their partners than in people of their own gender.
So what does it all mean when you put it together? Well, if we look just at sexual freedom, only about a third of people, 35%, were truly egalitarian. Now, that's the biggest single chunk, so that's good. But look at the rest. Almost 60% held some kind of double standard, whether it was in favor of men or women. So yeah, the bias is definitely still kicking.
But this isn't just about what's going on inside our own heads. The researchers also wanted to know what bigger societal things might predict these views. What makes someone more likely to hold a double standard?
So what leads to that classic man-favorable double standard? They found 3 big predictors. First, just being older. Second, a psychological thing called social dominance orientation, which is just a fancy way of saying you prefer a world with clear hierarchies. And third, and this one is huge, is simply believing that everyone else thinks this way. The norm we think exists helps create the reality.
And this quote from the researchers just nails it, really. They say that even though our societies push for equality, the double standard isn't gone. It's adapting. It's showing up in new, sneakier ways.
Okay, so we've looked at the data, we've touched on the psychology. Let's bring it all home. Why is this more than just some interesting study? Why does this actually matter?
So here are the 3 big takeaways. Number 1, the old school double standard, still here, just a lot more subtle. 2, the bias completely flips depending on whether you're talking about freedom or shyness. And 3, this stuff isn't just some personal quirk. It's tied to our age, how we see the world, and what we think everyone else thinks is normal.
So, what's the final word? Well, the sexual double standard is not dead, not by a long shot. It hasn't vanished. It has just evolved. It's gotten more complicated, more nuanced, maybe even more politically correct, hiding inside words and ideas that seem totally harmless. And that kind of leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? If a bias this old, this powerful, can hide itself so cleverly inside a word like shyness, it really makes you wonder, what else is out there, hiding in plain sight? What other biases are we totally missing just because we aren't looking in the right places?